Would like to also introduce David Cornish. David's currently the General Manager of Meredith Dairies, the largest Australian integrated producer of manufacture of cheese and goat's milk. When I say currently, what we don't know about David is that yesterday morning when I rang him, he was also out actually milking the sheep and the goats, David, as well as running the business. So he wears many hats. He's intimately involved in the business. And on top of that, has over 20 years' experience, both as a leading financier, a leading farm advisor, and in the farm support services. David is passionate about Australian agriculture, has been for many years. He's also passionate about seeing a lamb roast on his plate as a challenge and nothing more than that. And David's topic today from a producer's point of view is what crisis? Thank you, David.
Thanks, Chris. As I say, I feel a bit of an imposter here as a producer. As some of you will know, like one in particular up the back will know, is I've worked with the NAB for about 15 years. So if you've worked in agribusiness, you would have come across some of my footprints, and I apologise for that. Okay, crisis, what crisis? So when Chris rang me, the first thing I thought of, and this is how my mind thought, was of the old Supertramp album. Some of you are probably too young to remember a band called Supertramp, but and these albums were actually in these black things that used to come out there. But anyway, they had this great photo on this album called Crisis, What Crisis? I suppose what I want to reiterate with that, I'm not saying there isn't a food crisis, but I think it's really important. I think we've got a really good introduction to what does that crisis actually mean. Is it a question of that we don't produce enough food? Is it a question of distribution? Is it a question of morally and ethically actually how we deal with food within our food chain and when it hits our plate? There's a whole lot of questions there that actually impinge quite significantly on this question of food crisis. It's not new. I mean, I've got some quotes here from a bloke, the Reverend Thomas Malthus in 1798, talking about the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power on the earth to produce subsistence for man. If you are interested in this topic, you would have heard of a group of people called the Club of Rome. They produced a report in the early 70s called The Limits to Growth, which was, I suppose, what Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring was to environment. This was to economic growth and the ability that the world could go on forever. It has been criticised, and I'm one of those people who have criticised it because of some of the modelling was used. But what they did was try to wake us up to the fact that we couldn't continue to grow the way that we wanted to grow without expecting that resources will run out. But at that time, it was thought that resources were going to be there forever, which, if you think about it, didn't make a lot of sense. And of course, a couple of years later, along came the oil crisis. Another guy called Lester Brown in 1995 talked about this question of population growth, especially in China, and how it was going to lead to food prices rising. Now, at that stage, I was working in the farm sector I was working with the NAB and as a rural advisory. And when people start talking that and you're dealing with farmers, you say, well, that's fantastic. Are we going to get prices rise? Are we finally going to get prices rise to the levels that would mean that this is a highly profitable part of the organisation? Because obviously if any of us with a basic economics degree, if you can remember, I can't, but apparently there's a thing called demand and supply. When obviously demand goes up and supply goes down, prices rise. So what's actually happened? I suppose I want to start off with is some facts from a group called FAO, Food and Agriculture Organisation. So it's not me, so you can blame the UN for these facts, but what they say is that the percentage of hungry people has actually declined from close to 35% of the world population, 69-71, to 20% in 2009. And the overall calories per person has increased, not decreased. Now, what you've got to be careful with percentages still means there are more hungry people now than there were in the 60s and 70s. But you would argue that our ability has actually improved to provide food on the plate. Population growth is slowing and should plateau by 2050. So we're not seeing populations are expected to continue to rise. What they're actually saying is, well, we actually hit peak population growth around 1990. Now that's, 2050, that's still 9 million. How many people do you think there are in the world at the moment? It's about 7.5 billion. So there's still a few mouths to come onto the planet. But what we're doing is the actual percentage increase is actually declining from what it was in the 70s, 1970s and 1990s, and what they're projecting going forward. They also say we have enough cropland out there that we could double the current hectares that we have under cropping now. Important, this is not impinging on the needs for forests, protected areas or urbanisation. So they're saying if you set those aside, we still have enough farmland out there that we could double our acreage. But what they also say, and this is all in, if you are interested in this, so Nature did a report on this, is what they also say, it's all about we still need to intensify that. Rather than using that land, we could actually use that land for other things. But if we actually put our heads together and continue the productivity improvements that we've seen in agriculture over the last 30 to 40 years, we might not have to use that land. We can actually use that land for other important things. As I said, start off crisis, what crisis? What I did was went and had a look at what wheat prices were as an average of weekly earnings in the 1970s. So what's a tonne of wheat worth in 1970 compared as a percentage to what the average weekly earnings was? Anyone want to have a guess? Well, it's about 90%. So in other words, the price of a tonne of wheat was equivalent to 90% of the weekly average weekly earnings in 1970. What do you think it is now? It's 31%. Okay, so even when we're saying at the moment that we're having these price rises, the reality is that our systems of producing food have made food cheaper and cheaper relative to what your earnings are. So in fact, if we were to maintain the relativities, the price of wheat today would be $775 a tonne, rather than the mid-200s that we're paying now. And we're all saying that we're in a price spike with regards to wheat prices. Now again, what we've done that is because of this investment in productivity. We've actually been able to produce more with less. The concerning fact there is that from that's pretty based on the ability for obviously us to invest in research to make that happen. The reality is, and this is not only in Australia, but I'll use Australia as a model of that, is that we're actually seeing a decline in the amount of money that we invest in agricultural research. What ABARE, which is the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Resource and Economics in Canberra, has shown is that there is a strong correlation between our ability to produce more with less and the amount we spend on research. At the moment worldwide we spend less. If we look at the research development budget worldwide, there's about 782 billion spent on research and development. Of that, less than 5% is actually spent on agriculture. So if we're saying that there's this issue about food, and the reality is what we're doing as a society is saying, yes, we're concerned about that, but we're not investing in solutions to deal with it. I suppose the last thing I want to talk about is governments. Thank you, Chris. And it is my last points. But again, if we look at what governments have done with, for instance, the biofuel, biofuel issue, if this feeding the world is such an important issue, why are we subsidising people to put ethanol into their SUVs? Because basically a tank of ethanol is the amount of grain that's required to feed a person for a year. So we have this dilemma about saying, here is a problem with greenhouse warming, here is a solution, biofuels, without actually thinking through the ramifications of what that means to actually supporting a society and a community, both at a worldwide level. So I suppose what concerns me is that if we continue to go for, we've got to be careful of with politicians, is there seems to be a political solution, and we're going to see this with water, or is there actually a sustainable solution? And my concern is that politicians, especially in agriculture, have erred on the later rather than actually making good sustainable decisions. Thanks, Chris.